During its quiet afternoon, the old man happened to witness a small bobcat cub approach a small trickle of water dripping from an old rusted pipe protruding from the ground. It cautiously stepped forward, its delicate paws barely making a sound on the dry leaves scattered around the rustic cabin's yard. Its soft, tiny fur with faint spots gleamed under the scorching sun filtering through the sparse trees. The old man, sitting on a worn-out wooden chair on his porch, chuckled softly at the sight before him. His weathered face, marked by years of experience and endless stories, crinkled with a gentle smile as he watched the curious creature approach. But as the cub tried to drink, he noticed its desperation. The dry earth had nothing to offer. The old man's smile faded. Would he stand by, or would he intervene? The humor in the old man's eyes soon gave way to concern. He noticed the parched ground, the cracked earth thirsting as much as the tiny creature before him. The cub's frantic attempts to lap up the meager trickle of water stirred something deep within him. He sighed, the sound carrying the weight of memories from a time long gone. He remembered when the forest behind his cabin was alive, lush, untamed, full of song. Birds once filled the air with their melodies, leaves whispered with the wind, and wolves howled in the distance. But those days were fading. Deforestation, pollution, and unchecked expansion had drained the land's soul, leaving a hollow echo of its former self. As the cub trembled with thirst, the old man made his decision. His joints protested as he stood, moving slowly but deliberately. He approached the pipe, whispering soothing words, his voice as gentle as the wind weaving through dying trees. Adjusting the pipe, he let more water flow. The cub hesitated. Fear and instinct held it back, but thirst overpowered doubt. It clung to the pipe, drinking eagerly. Its amber eyes flickered between survival and trust. And in that fleeting moment, something changed. The bobcat cub's small body remained tense. It lapped at the water, but its muscles stayed coiled, ready to flee at the slightest movement. The old man remained motionless, his breath steady, his presence calm. He had seen fear like this before, in the eyes of animals, in the eyes of men. Then, something unexpected happened. The cub, instead of darting away, inched closer. Its amber eyes flickered with hesitation, but also something else, curiosity. It sniffed the air, whiskers twitching, before cautiously glancing up at the man. For a moment, the old man and the cub simply stared at each other. The forest was silent, the wind holding its breath. Then, in a slow, deliberate movement, the cub took another sip, this time, without fear. A connection had formed, fragile yet undeniable. But neither knew how much their lives were about to change. The old man remained still, watching as the cub finished drinking. It was small, barely larger than a house cat, yet its tiny frame carried the resilience of the wild. For a long moment, it simply stood there, eyes flicking between the man and the forest, as if caught between two worlds. Then, just as he thought it would retreat, the cub did something unexpected. It took a hesitant step toward him. The old man's withered face softened. He reached into his pocket, retrieving a small piece of dried meat from his morning meal. Holding it out, he remained patient. The cub's nose twitched as it sniffed the air before, cautiously, taking the offering. The days passed, and the cub began lingering near the cabin. At first, it stayed on the outskirts, always watching. But little by little, it grew bolder. The old man would catch glimpses of it darting between the trees, chasing after fluttering leaves. One morning, as he stepped outside, he found the cub curled up on his porch, its soft purring blending with the gentle rustling of the wind. A bond was forming, one that neither had expected. The old man found himself speaking to the cub as he went about his day. "You remind me of the past," he would say, glancing toward the fading forest. "Back when this place was alive." The cub would tilt its head, amber eyes filled with curiosity, as if trying to understand. As time went on, the cub became part of his world. It followed him through the garden, pouncing on fallen twigs. It curled at his feet by the fire, its soft fur a comforting presence against the quiet. And the old man, who had lived in solitude for years, found his heart growing lighter. But even in joy, shadows lingered. The forest, once teeming with life, had become eerily silent. Birds no longer sang in unison, and the rustling leaves were sparse. The old man often stared into the trees, a quiet worry settling in his chest. The cub was growing stronger, wilder. And though he wished it could stay, he knew deep down that the call of the wild would come. The question wasn't if, but when. As autumn deepened, the cub grew stronger, its once scrawny frame filling out with lean muscle. It moved with the grace of a hunter, its instincts sharpening with each passing day. The old man watched with quiet admiration, but beneath it, an unease settled in his chest. The cub had begun wandering beyond the cabin's clearing, vanishing into the trees for longer stretches of time. At first, it would always return before dusk, bounding toward him as if the world beyond was merely a passing curiosity. But soon, the hours stretched longer. Some nights, the cub returned with the scent of the wild clinging to its fur, its amber eyes alight with something ancient and untamed. The old man knew what was happening. The cub was listening to a call he could never silence. And yet, he couldn't help but hope that maybe, just maybe, it would choose to stay. Then, the storm came. The sky darkened without warning, rolling clouds swallowing the last light of day. The wind howled through the trees, bending branches to their breaking point. Rain fell in sheets, turning the dry earth into mud. And for the first time since it had found him, the cub did not return. The old man stood on the porch, lantern in hand, his heart pounding with an urgency he hadn't felt in years. His eyes searched the darkness, scanning the forest's edge, waiting, hoping. But the wind carried only the sound of rustling leaves and distant thunder. Dread coiled in his chest. Had the cub found shelter? Was it lost, frightened, hurt? He stepped forward, the cold rain soaking through his clothes, but uncertainty held him back. The forest was vast, unforgiving. If the cub was out there, it was beyond his reach now. The night dragged on, each hour stretching into an eternity. He sat on the porch, unwilling to leave, his hands gripping the lantern as if its dim glow could guide the cub home. But morning came, and the cub did not. The emptiness was deafening. The silence of the forest pressed against him, heavier than ever before. And for the first time in years, the old man felt truly alone. Days passed, each one heavier than the last. The cabin, once filled with soft purrs and playful rustling, felt hollow. The old man barely slept, his ears straining for a sound that never came. He told himself that the cub had simply returned to where it belonged, that this was the way of the wild. But his heart ached with the uncertainty of it all. Then, one evening, a sound shattered the silence, a fragile whimper, barely audible over the whispering wind. The old man's heart lurched. He grabbed his lantern, rushing toward the sound, his hands trembling with both fear and hope. And there it was. The cub, barely recognizable beneath matted fur and streaks of dried blood, staggered toward the porch. Its once bright amber eyes were dulled by pain, but the moment they met his, something familiar flickered within them. Without hesitation, the old man knelt, gathering the trembling creature in his arms. "You came back," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He carried it inside, laying it on a soft blanket by the fire. The following days were a blur of careful tending. He cleaned its wounds, whispered soothing words, and fed it by hand when it was too weak to eat on its own. Slowly, the cub began to recover. The light returned to its eyes, and its small purrs, though faint, filled the cabin once more. But something had changed. The cub no longer curled beside him at night. It no longer chased leaves in the garden. Instead, it often sat by the window, staring into the trees, ears twitching at the distant sounds of the wild. The old man saw it for what it was, not restlessness, but longing. And so, with a heavy heart, he made his decision. One crisp morning, he led the cub to the forest's edge. The golden light of dawn stretched between them, casting long shadows on the earth. He knelt beside it, running a gentle hand over its fur one last time. "Go," he whispered. His voice wavered, but he did not stop it. The cub hesitated, amber eyes locking with his. Then, with a final glance, it turned and disappeared into the wild. And the old man, standing alone beneath the vast sky, felt both loss and peace intertwine. Seasons passed, and the old man remained, though time weighed heavier on him now. His once strong hands trembled with age, his steps slower, his hair silvered like the frost that blanketed the forest each winter. Yet, every morning, he still gazed toward the trees, searching, hoping. Years melted into memory, and the world grew quieter around him. The laughter of birds had long faded, and the forest, once his sanctuary, felt distant. But in his heart, he still felt the presence of the one creature that had given him purpose. Then, on a bitter winter night, a sound stirred him from his chair, a soft scratching at the door. His breath caught. With trembling hands, he rose and opened it. There, bathed in moonlight, stood a fully grown bobcat. Its amber eyes, fierce yet familiar, locked onto his. For a moment, time held its breath. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the bobcat turned, vanishing into the trees. The old man smiled. That night, as the fire crackled softly, he closed his eyes for the last time. By morning, fresh paw prints circled the cabin, an unspoken farewell, whispered by the wild.